I want to welcome Brian Perry here today to Drupal Camp Asheville. We're really excited to have him talk today. Brian is he's a great community member that has a lot of awesome talks on front-end technologies and component-based design and things of that nature. His topic today is an overview on front-end component integration methods in Drupal. It's definitely going to be, I think, a really good talk, very interesting talk. So I'm looking forward to seeing it. So I'm going to go on mute. And Brian, welcome. Thank you for doing this. And we're excited to have you.
Happy to be here. Yeah, let's see, I'll cut my video here so the slides can be big for everybody. But I assure you, I'm still here. I think that worked. Anyway, yeah, thanks for the intro, Adam. This is an overview of front-end component integration methods in Drupal. Maybe I will just keep my video on. Who knows? So there's the bit.ly link down there, bit.ly/component-int. And that's going to take you to a GitHub repo. The README has links to these slides. And then there's also a little sandbox repo that has the examples we'll be going through in this talk. But yeah, super excited to be here at Drupal Camp Asheville. Have never been able to make the scheduling work to attend in person. And now that no one is attending in person, it was easy for me to participate. So very excited. All right, so let's dive in. So I am Brian Perry. I'm a lead front-end developer at Bounteous, and I live out in the Chicago suburbs. As mentioned, and as we'll be talking about today, I am a lover of all things kind of component-driven and component-based. So building and theming with components in Drupal, and design systems and tools like Pattern Lab and Storybook, and increasingly building using JavaScript component-based frameworks like React. And also a lover of all things Nintendo. So happy to talk about the cool games that everybody's playing on their Nintendo Switch. For me, it's been Animal Crossing New Horizons for a very long time. I've almost paid off my mortgage. And then I'm also available on the internet in a variety of places and would love to internet with you. And as I mentioned, I work at a company called Bounteous. We have offices throughout North America, back when working in offices was a thing. And in those days, I was based out of one of our 2 Chicago offices. Drupal is one of a handful of things that we do at Bounteous, but I primarily work within our Drupal practice with a bunch of great Drupal folks that I learn from on a day-to-day basis. And we're often hiring. So if you're looking to do great Drupal work, get in touch. And if you're looking to have great Drupal work done, I can definitely get you in touch with somebody as well. And just wanted to quickly acknowledge 2020 and the interesting time that we're all in, mainly just from the perspective of during everything that we as a world are going through. It's been great to be part of this community. It's been really nice being stuck in my house and being able to participate in events like this and continue contributing back to Drupal. And I'm also happy to be part of a community that is, trying to work on bettering ourselves and expanding our diversity, and also, acknowledging some of the mistakes that we've made along the way. So hoping that we can all be together in person in the future, but also that we can make the most of the spot that we're in right now. So let's talk about components. And before we talk about integrating into components, let's just really quickly at a high level talk about component-based development and what it is. So it's creating modular and reusable elements by building a system rather than just a series of pages. So if you're handed off a static Photoshop mockup, rather than just building that instance of that page, you're breaking it into its individual parts that can then be used to assemble that template and other templates. And it's often used with a pattern library tool for documentation and prototyping, things like Pattern Lab and Storybook. But this general approach doesn't require that. So you can still take this approach of breaking things down into their component parts even if you're not using those tools. And it's popularized by Brad Frost's atomic design concept, which is a particular framework, a particular way to describe breaking things down into their smaller parts with this atom molecules metaphor. But if that terminology works for you, great. If there's another way that you can describe this, that's fine too, just as long as the general idea is breaking things down into reusable parts. So why would somebody take this approach? A handful of reasons. One is efficient reuse. So you're building and writing these components in a way that can be created once and reused in a bunch of different contexts. That could be reused multiple times within the scope of a single Drupal project, across multiple Drupal projects, or even at its extreme across different CMSs, for example. And it'll often give you nice, well-isolated chunks of code. Typically, there's certain structure and naming conventions that are followed. So it's really easy to see what makes up an individual component, what its sub-elements are, things like that. It also opens up some interesting possibilities as far as decoupling front-end and back-end development. So it's possible to build these front-end components in isolation before the functionality completely exists in Drupal. So theming doesn't have to be a thing that's tacked on at the end. And also using a living style guide or pattern library along with this also provides some advantages. It can help with coordination between designers and developers, or even developers and developers. Opens the door to rapid prototyping. So it's you don't have to have things fully built out in Drupal to experiment with new combinations of components or new templates, and also can just provide a great source of truth for your design system. I've even used a pattern library as a kind of test bed for screenshot tests. So now let's, for this talk, we're going to basically just look at one example component and talk about all of the different ways we can provide data to it for a Drupal site. So I wasn't kidding about my love for Nintendo and Nintendo things. So our example component is this container component using the NES.CSS framework, which is a cool little project that lets you have nice old school Nintendo looking things, pixelated images, and all that stuff. So we just have our container component here. And if we just look at that component, there are a number of different variables, essentially, that we're going to provide data to. There's the title and a couple of tags up top, the platform and the year, an image, body text, and that kind of call to action link. So this is a Twig template that represents the markup for this component. You'll see that we have classes from the NES.CSS framework, like NES container, that NES badge, and is splitted, and a number of variables for the different kind of slots in this component that we looked at. Nothing really all that complicated here, just kind of the right markup classes and variables. But that's a quick look at what the structure of this template looks like. And then in this particular example, we're using Pattern Lab alongside this. So this is a YAML file. Pattern Lab will also allow you to use a JSON file that represents example data for this component. So we see that we have an example image, body copy, all that stuff. And that allows us to render an example of this container component so we can see what it would look like with actual representative data. And then one last piece here in our example, we're going to display these containers in a grid layout. So we have a 3-up grid of game nodes from Drupal in this case. And then this is the CSS that allows us to have this grid layout. Again, really not a lot here. There is a wrapping grid class, that LGrid, that just allows us to use CSS grid at different responsive breakpoints. So now let's look at using these components in Drupal. So we have our example built out. We can see what it looks like in Pattern Lab. How do we get it going in Drupal? So there's a couple of kind of dividing lines that we'll look at through this talk. So the first one is going to be where our components live. So from the perspective of this talk, there's the concept of standard Drupal components and integrated Drupal components. And really the distinction is, so for standard Drupal components, they live in your default template directory. So the Drupal's templates directory in a theme or also a module. And because this is where Drupal expects them to live, it's probably not going to require much or potentially any additional effort to get data from Drupal to display in it. Then on the other hand, there is the concept of an integrated Drupal component. So really the only distinction there is it lives somewhere other than the default Drupal templates directory. And because of that, it means it's going to require some additional effort to get data to display in that component. And for what we're talking about today, it really doesn't matter how your integrated components get into your theme. They could be a separate directory within your theme. They could be an external dependency of your theme that you pull in via Composer or NPM. But the general idea of providing data to them is going to be the same. So standard Drupal components. Again, these are components that live in the templates directory where Drupal traditionally expects them. So this approach could definitely be right for your team or project. I know we'll look at some fancier, more involved approaches later, but there are definitely a lot of cases where this approach makes the most sense. So here you're building with Drupal and really only Drupal in mind, and structuring around things that can be easily reused in Drupal. So things like display modes and blocks. People often use paragraphs to represent this, layouts in Drupal, things like that. So there's already a lot of concepts in Drupal that allow you to create nice reusable pieces that you can use throughout your Drupal site and Drupal theme. One thing that you do lose out on here is some of the rapid prototyping advantages that we talked about. To be able to stand examples up and see what they look like, you basically have to build them in Drupal first. So from the perspective of a standard Drupal component, we're using a view mode of teaser to represent this container component. We also have a content type called game that has the content and fields that we're looking to provide to this container. So the title is the label, and then we have field platform, field image, body, etc. So those are going into the variables that we've defined in our component. So for our game content type, this is a node game teaser template suggestion, and it's a copy of the default node template from the classy theme, I believe. So to make things look like our container, in the classes array, we just need to provide some of the classes that the nes.css framework needs. So that's our NES container with title and is centered. And the rest of these classes are things that are in the default template. And then really what we're doing is adjusting the markup that this template renders so that it can give us the structure and classes that we need for our container. So, we pass in the classes array, and then you'll see that we have some additional wrapping markup, like our NES badge is splitted for the two tags, and we're explicitly rendering out the fields that we need in the spaces where we need them to be in our component. And at the end of the day, that's going to give us something that looks like that container that we saw. And then for our grid, we're representing this in this case as a view called games. And similar idea here. We're finding, we're overriding a template that Drupal would expect for this. In this case, it's an unformatted view template for this games view. And really all we're doing here is basically just adding an additional wrapping div with that LGrid class that we've defined before. And that will allow our containers to be in that 3-up grid. I see some questions coming in already, which is amazing. I'll make sure that we have some time. So next up, we'll look at integrated Drupal components. So we looked at doing this with Drupal's default. And now we'll look at all the different ways that we can provide data to components that live outside of the traditional templates directory. So as I've mentioned before, in this little example, we're using Pattern Lab. And in our theme, we just have an NES components directory where these components live, and follows kind of Pattern Lab's default structure. There's a source patterns directory, and then a components folder that has a container subdirectory that has all of the files that we need for this container. So that allows us to see what it looks like in Pattern Lab with example data. We can see examples of the markup, all before Drupal provides data to this thing. And then one thing that we'll need in most cases is the components module in Drupal. And what the components module does is it allows us to define Twig namespaces so that we can access these templates in somewhere other than the templates directory. Because by default, Drupal only discovers things in the templates directory. And so in our info.yaml file, in the component library section, we can define our Twig namespaces. We've just got one for this little example called components. And we point to the location of that components directory that we saw before. And so that lets Drupal discover the templates and also lets us use a little namespace shortcut that we'll see in a bit. So now another kind of dividing line is how we get data, how we integrate into these components. And there's primarily two categories here. Mapping data in code and mapping data in the admin UI. So mapping in code is going to be things like doing mapping in a Twig template or in preprocess, or essentially any approach to using backend code there. There's also themes and starter kits that will help you with this approach. I find that mapping data in code is a little bit more likely to result in something that gets out of sync with the Drupal UI. For example, the manage display tab not representing exactly what's being rendered within your component. And also, if you're not careful, if you strip too much away, you can break things that Drupal depends on, like quick edit or create issues with caching and so on. And then on the other hand, there's mapping data in the admin UI. So this is things like using the UI patterns module or using Drupal layouts. And because this kind of goes through Drupal, a Drupal module and the Drupal UI, I find it's less likely to disrupt Drupal functionality, but possibly not as flexible in that, there's certain things that these modules can and can't do, and also certain conventions that you need to follow. So mapping data in code. We'll look at a couple of different approaches, but really we're still using a view mode of teaser to represent this component, and we still have all the same data from Drupal that we're trying to get into it. So first we'll look at mapping in a Twig template. So this is using the concept of a presenter template. So in Drupal's default template directory, we have a node game teaser template. So this is what Drupal would expect to render this game node. But instead of having all of our markup here, what we're doing is we're including our template from our pattern library, that container.twig template. So we're using Twig's include, and then we're saying with and mapping all of the fields from Drupal to the variables in our Twig template. So label goes to title, content field platform goes to platform, and so on. And also there's that at components, which is our namespace defined by the components module. So that is really just providing serving as like a middleman to pass the data over to our component in our component library. And then alternatively, we could do the same thing within preprocess. So here in our nes.theme file, we have a hook preprocess node for the game node. And this is really basically the simplest possible preprocess function, but it's essentially doing the same thing that we saw in that Twig template. It's just taking the variables that are available in this preprocess function and mapping them to the particular variable that the template expects. There's obviously a lot more that you can do here. So there's additional logic that could happen within a preprocess function. You could reference other things, but as far as just getting the variables to the spot that they belong in your Twig template, that's all this example is doing. And then in our node game teaser template, we're still using the include statement to reference the container Twig template in our component library. But because all of the data is already queued up to go into the right place, we don't have to do the mapping in the Twig template if we don't want to. And there are also a number of different helper modules that are going to make the mapping process easier, potentially. There's Twig field value, which lets you get partial data from field render arrays. So for example, you can use that field value filter, and that's just going to give you the content and not the wrapping markup. So it makes it easier to map just the data that you want. But depending on what you do here, especially if you're using that field target entity to get a referenced entity, there may be additional considerations you need to take related to caching to make sure that Drupal knows when it needs to invalidate things. And then there's Twig tweak, which gives you a bunch of helpful functions and filters. You can do things like render views, blocks, regions, fields, particular image styles. So if there's something that you're finding tricky to do in your Twig template, odds are pretty high that Twig tweak may already have it solved for you. And then there are also a number of great starter kits and themes that are available to give you a great starting point for taking this approach. So they're going to simplify setup. They're also going to, in most cases, handle the front-end tooling and workflow. Some have example or like baseline components that you can use. And they vary in how opinionated they are and how much configuration control you have. But there are a handful of great options here. EMULSIFY seems to be a very popular option for people starting out with this approach. There's also the Gesso theme, Shyla, and Particle, which are also great options here. And in general, as far as what we're looking at here, there's really not a ton to show. But I did take one example using EMULSIFY, specifically the most recent version of EMULSIFY, which is the EMULSIFY design system. And that's a little interesting in that it uses Storybook for HTML as opposed to Pattern Lab. So in this case, it's still the same concept with these presenter templates, but the components live in a different place. Storybook and also EMULSIFY just have a different convention for where things live. And it's using Storybook, which is a different component library tool. But at the end of the day, we're still seeing our container template represented in our pattern library with all the data passed into it. And then for Storybook, it's a little bit of a different structure for setting up our story in this case. So we have to import our Twig template and the assets that we need to use along with our data. But still, the same general idea. We're just getting our template and our example data and rendering it out on screen. And then in our theme based on EMULSIFY, we see our container components, just as we would expect. So I just think that this simple little example is interesting in that, completely different pattern library tool, using a JavaScript-based approach, but still at the end of the day, all that we're doing is providing data into those templates that live somewhere else. So now let's talk about mapping data in the admin UI. So the first example that we'll look at there is the UI patterns module. So how I like to describe the UI patterns module is it allows you to define and manage components in a way that Drupal understands. So UI patterns in this case are Drupal plugins. And then those patterns can be used with component-friendly modules like views and field groups, layout builder, paragraphs, display suite. And then when those patterns are available, it allows you to configure the mappings in Drupal's admin UI rather than doing it in a Twig template or preprocess in code like we saw before. It also exposes an optional pattern library page, which is kind of like a mini pattern lab in Drupal. And you can also do things like preprocess your patterns, render patterns programmatically, and all that good stuff. So here's our container component again. So this time it's represented as a pattern, a container pattern in this case. And all of the same variables in our Twig template are still exactly the same. And to define our pattern, we have to create a pattern.yaml file. This could theoretically contain multiple patterns, but the common convention is to have a pattern.yaml file for each of your patterns. And so it has a machine name of container, a label, and a description. And then a lot of the other stuff you see here is defining the individual fields. So for each field, you can specify a type, which is mainly just used for documentation, a label, description, and then preview is example data that gets passed into that field. So you'll see that there's strings, example markup, and things like that. And then also, if we look a little lower in this YAML file, there are a couple of cool additional features here. One is that you can define libraries. So if there are certain assets that need to be loaded when this pattern is used, you can define them in a library and it'll be loaded. So we just have our CSS that gets loaded along with this pattern. And they can be used as dependencies in other libraries, which is kind of useful. And then there's the use key down at the bottom. And this basically says, when I render this pattern, just go out to the pattern library and use this container.twig template from our pattern library. It essentially is behind the scenes doing the same thing that we've seen examples of with that presenter template, but you don't actually have to create and explicitly define that template in the middle. So that's kind of nice. And then this is an example of the pattern library page in Drupal. Obviously, it looks pretty crazy because we're using that nes.css framework, but there's an example of our container component, a table that has all the different fields described. So this is a nice little piece of documentation kind of explicitly showing the Drupal-ready components, the components that are ready to be easily integrated in the admin UI. And UI Patterns offers a number of integration modules. We'll just look at one for a simple, quick example, UI Patterns views. So we have our games view here, and with a pattern defined, we're going to specify that we want to show a pattern. And when we do that, in the row options for the view, we can pick our pattern, we pick our container pattern, and then that allows us on a field-by-field basis to map the field in our view and what variable in our pattern it should be passed to. So that's the general idea, and it's really handy to be able to do this within the UI. So the end result is that every row in the view is rendered using that container. And, again, it looks like our fancy video game. So it's also possible to do this with layouts in Drupal. So here, the overall thing is a layout, a container layout that we're going to be creating. And layouts have regions. So each of the individual slots in this component are going to be regions in this case. And then there's a couple of different ways that you can define a layout in Drupal. In this example, we're just using a layouts.yaml file in our theme. And we give it a machine name, label, category, and then probably the most important thing here is defining the template. And that has to live in Drupal's template directory. And it also has to have an html.twig extension. And then beyond that, we're just defining the regions, which will look a lot like the fields that we've seen represented over and over. And then in our template that we defined, we're doing essentially the mapping that we've seen a couple of examples of. So we have our Twig include statement, and we're referencing the container pattern in our pattern library and mapping the region from our layout into the field in our component template. So if you want to use these layouts with Layout Builder, there are certainly some additional considerations. Basically, you need to make sure that the kind of markup and structure that Layout Builder depends on still gets rendered. Without it, you won't be able to do drag and drop things in Layout Builder. So you need to make sure that you're using the attributes objects, the region attributes for each of the individual fields is also really important. So you need to make sure that at the end of the day, the structure that Layout Builder depends on is there. But also, you need to make sure if you're using a pattern library tool, that it can understand things like attributes and add class and all of that stuff. So it doesn't blow up in your pattern library. There's a lot of ways to solve that problem, but it might not be something that's set up out of the box for you. So the end result that you get is you can add a section in Layout Builder and pick your container component in this case, and you see a visual representation of your component. So we see all the different fields, and we can add blocks into those regions. You'll also notice that depending on how your component is structured, representing it visually might not completely make sense. You'll see that for our tags, things are starting to kind of overlap and look a little funky. So it's definitely possible to represent your components in Layout Builder like this, but it might not make sense in all cases. So we've also covered a lot of these challenges. So you need to make sure that you retain the things that Layout Builder needs if you want to use Layout Builder with these. And then the kind of other thing to consider is that if you're using Layout Builder, it's going to introduce some additional markup that you need to make sure that your component can handle gracefully. All right, checking time. Want to make sure that we have some time for questions. So I'll try to breeze through the last few things I want to cover here. So one last kind of fork in the road is component definition approaches. So we have the concept of manual definition, which is pretty much everything that we've looked at before. We're defining the component in code somehow so that Drupal becomes aware of it. And that's probably going to result in some amount of duplication between Drupal and the things that are in your component library, versus the kind of emerging and experimental concept of automatic discovery. So in this case, Drupal module is going to automatically discover things from your component library and make them available to Drupal. So typically that expects some particular convention or particular approach. So it may not work with all component libraries, but it'll certainly work with some. So let's look at a couple of examples of automatic discovery. The first is the UI Patterns Pattern Lab module, which is a module that I maintain. And it allows, it automatically discovers components in a pattern lab instance and creates them as UI patterns available in Drupal. So the end result will give you exactly what we saw with our UI patterns example, but you don't actually have to create a patterns.yaml file manually, which typically there's going to be a lot of overlap with what's in that file and what's in your component definition. It does require that you're using a YAML or JSON file to define your pattern data. That's how it knows what fields need to be created in the pattern. And there's some considerations you're going to have to make as far as nested components, so that it's possible to render components inside of other components if that's something you're looking to do. And then a similar concept is the layouts from Pattern Lab module. I'd say this is either very early or potentially in the area of a failed experiment on my part, but same sort of idea in that it can discover patterns from a pattern library, Pattern Lab in this case, and expose them as layouts in Drupal that you can then integrate into. There's definitely some limitations with this approach. There are still some issues with Layout Builder drag and drop, and there's a funky little bug with Pattern Lab 3 where it actually doesn't work with the HTML.twig extension, so you have to do some gymnastics to get around that at the moment. But still, I think the concept of being able to automatically have layouts represented in Drupal from things in a component library is pretty interesting. And then something that I don't maintain, it's maintained by the folks over at Red Hat, is the PatternKit module. And this kind of has a little bit of both manual definition and automatic discovery. It depends on a schema definition file, a JSON schema file. But it will automatically drive blocks from your pattern library components. Supports a specific set of field types. It's in active development. There's a Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 module. And the Drupal 8 module, there's still things that are being added to it. But here's a quick example of what that looks like. So in our libraries.yaml file, we're adding a pattern section, and we're just saying the path to our patterns and that they're Twig patterns in this case. And then this is what an example JSON schema file would look like here. So it's similar conceptually to a lot of the examples that we looked at where we're defining all of the different fields. But there are also some options that are provided here so that it knows what field type to create for this block. And you can also provide settings that are available for the block as well. And the end result is in the blocks UI, you get the fields for this component and settings that can specify exactly what style is used for the component. But at the end of the day, we still get our container component that we've seen just about 1,000 times at this point. And then kind of a last area that I just want to touch on quickly are prepackaged component solutions, because I think this is also an interesting area. One great example is the Bolt design system maintained by the folks at Pegasystems. And these are a set of ready-to-use web components. It's a full design system, but it allows you to selectively require components from this design system. And they're web components, but also render as Twig. So this is a great example of just like a fully fleshed out set of components that can be included in a project. There's also a recent project called Componi, which is a component distribution system. It has a theme, a front-end workflow, and sets of components that you can pick from. One thing that doesn't quite fit with my workflow is, at least last I looked at this, it wasn't composer or NPM driven. But still, this idea of providing sets of prepackaged components that can easily be used in Drupal projects, I think, is interesting. And then one last thing in this neighborhood is the single file components module, which isn't really going to solve the integration problem, but it allows you to define components in Drupal with like a view style single file syntax, which you can then use like any template. But as you can see here, all of the markup and CSS and JavaScript that you need are all in this one file. and it's possible to derive blocks from these single file components. So it doesn't really solve the integration problem that we've been talking about, but does provide another really interesting option of a way to easily distribute prepackaged components in Drupal. So just to round out, and I do want to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions. I know it's getting a little tight here, but kind of my overall look at what I do from a workflow perspective now and where I'd like to see things go in the future. So my honest answer is that I'm still using kind of a mix of these approaches here. But in most cases, I'm using integrated components. The vast majority of my templates, CSS and JavaScript, live outside of the Drupal templates directory. For simple, lightweight components, I'm still pushing to try to be able to make the component mapping something that can be done in the Drupal UI. But for things that are complicated, I tend to do pre-process over the Twig mapping for those. And our teams have gotten pretty good at being able to provide backend developers providing helper functions to make this easier. And I also have a set of pre-process like helper classes that I'm hoping to open source in the future. And then we tend to build components that can be exposed as blocks and used with the layout builder. And we tend to use custom block types and a very limited use of paragraphs at this point. So, what's my dream workflow? The short answer is that something similar to the workflow I'm used to in React projects is what I'd love. Being able to easily install a component, import them into my code, and just use them as I see fit and pass data into them. So, how can we as a Drupal community get there? It seems like we have a lot of the pieces of the puzzle, but just kind of need to continue refining and kind of standardize. So I think the more that we can do to make it easier to package and distribute individual components is going to help a lot there. I still think there's value in improving the UI integration here and allowing you to do mapping within the Drupal UI, specifically focusing on Layout Builder, as that has been a popular option in Drupal 8. And I also do think that there's value in the approaches that we saw as far as automatically discovering components. But also at the end of the day, I think that we just need to keep building great component-based sites in Drupal. And I also want to just take this last second as I cross the finish line here to thank the many folks, more than I can name, in the kind of Drupal component ecosystem who've shared what they've learned and actually, shared their code. I've learned so much, and I'm happy to be just a tiny little piece of this cool ecosystem in Drupal. So would love any feedback on this talk, but do want to make sure that we sneak in a little bit of time for questions too.
Thank you, Brian. I've been taking a look at the chat, and I have collected the questions. So I want to say great talk. This was excellent and very broad with a lot of good information.
Thank you.
So Jonathan asked, do you have any thoughts between Pattern Lab and Storybook?
Yeah, I think both are great options. I've used Pattern Lab a lot, and teams within Bounteous were pretty comfortable with Pattern Lab. There does seem to be interest shifting to Storybook as an option. And the great thing about Storybook is that basically Storybook works with any templating engine under the sun at this point. So that's kind of cool. But I would say that its support for Twig is still evolving a little bit. It uses Twig.js, which is a particular JavaScript implementation of Twig. So I would look at Storybook if you are using things in addition to Twig. If you're just using Twig, Pattern Lab's still a pretty great option.
Thank you. There's kind of a high-level question, I believe, that Jonathan also had, which was, of all the approaches that you've talked about for integration, what would you recommend based on the size of the team or the skill of the team?
Yeah, and so That really kind of depends on your team. So I'm hoping that what this part of what this talk gives is options that you can choose based on the makeup of people that you have on your team. But really at a high level, I would say if I'd start with one of the two mapping options that we looked at, either mapping in Twig templates, and that so if it's primarily front-end developers who are doing this that are more comfortable in Twig, I'd go that approach. If you have a back-end team that can support this, I'd say then you might prefer to do it in pre-process. But one of those two approaches, depending on your team's makeup, is where I'd start and where I find people typically start with this.
Cool. Final question was from Mark. Is there a JSX version of single file components? This could be useful for Gatsby.
There isn't, but there are definitely a lot of options in the general React ecosystem that allow you to get something close. React, I don't think really has a concept of a single file component, but if you use a CSS and JS solution like styled components or Emotion, you'll be pretty close in that you'll have all your JSX markup, all your JavaScript logic, and all of your scope styles all in one file. So React handles that pretty well too.
Great, and I want to open, I'm going to look at chat one last time. I don't believe I see any other questions, but if you have any other questions, please post them to chat now. Otherwise, we are at time. We're actually 2 minutes over.
Yep. I'll also just add that I'm around and love to talk about this stuff. So catch me on Slack or any of the millions of Drupal places, and happy to talk more.
Cool. We did have one final question, Brian. What do you see some good learning sources for this information?
That's a really good question, and one I wish I had a more prepared answer for. Maybe I'll follow up on Twitter. One thing that was really helpful for me when I was kind of first following along with this approach is the Four Kitchens folks that do EMULSIFY. There's a lot of great documentation around EMULSIFY, but they have a video series that really kind of covers the basics of this approach. And that was the thing that I found most useful when I was wrapping my head around this. So I'll follow up with that link.
Thank you so much, Brian. Great talk. Nice job. Thank you for being a part of this event today. We really appreciate it. And I want to thank all of you for coming. Feel free to reach out. Brian, if you could stop sharing your screen, I need to share the a transition slide here.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks. Wishing you all a great day.